Now is not the time to die. Okay, and welcome to Podcast Essentials, episode 22, as it turns out. This is the wrap-up episode for the series, and I'm joined, as usual, by my good friend from Blaney, New South Wales, Rich Bowden. You there, Rich?
I am, John, and thank you very much for having me on the shows now. We'll wrap up the series, and hello to listeners, hello to viewers.
Okay, so we'll just run through the sorts of things we covered during the series. And if there's any new ideas that occurred to either of us, which is possible, it's been that kind of a couple of months. So we started off looking at typical workflow for an episode, from idea through to published episode. Then we went on to, I did a thing on the medium is the message, so that when you think about podcasting, it is a different medium from print, obviously, but also from radio. And this YouTube thing is different from television. And we need to craft our words, our message, to actually match with the medium. And it's the authenticity and the closeness of podcasting that makes the difference for this medium, I think. You got thoughts on that, Rich?
Yeah, definitely, John. I think you covered it very well. We need to, as podcasters, understand, who our audience is, and that is completely different from the old radio audience. We're very much, I think, it's a much more intimate medium. I think, John, would you agree with that? Podcasting?
Yeah, because it's right into the ear normally. People who use headphones or earbuds or whatever, and it's just the beginning. We're only 14 years into the medium. So I think the exciting times are still ahead of us. And on that matter, the next episode was on about understanding the mechanics of podcasting, where I explained what Apple does and doesn't do. Since then, of course, Google's sort of put their foot into the water in a more formal manner. They're no longer pushing Google Play Music as their podcast place of choice. And they're actually applying their search algorithm to podcasting. And podcasts are going to start being a featured search item at the top of their pages. Now, to be part of the Google environment, ecosystem, I think is the phrase they use, the Google world, you need to have a separate page on a website somewhere with your RSS feed on it, and just one RSS feed. So if you're doing 3 or 4 shows like you will end up doing once you start podcasting, you need to have a separate page for each show. Now, we're fortunate in that because we publish with Libsyn, there's a separate blog that comes with the account, and that has that RSS feed in it. So Google's able to send out their bots and do their crawls, and then they find the RSS feed. And I did a few checks on some friends, what do we call them, Android apps, Android phones, loaded up the Google Podcast app on that, and all of my shows popped up. So the system's working. And I think we're on the cusp of something really big here.
So how long does it take, John? Sorry, I was just going to say, how long does it take before Google does pick up your show if you're just starting out?
Not sure on that one. They tend to crawl fairly regularly through the system. By the time I went and had a look, the Google Podcast app had been out for a little while, a week or something, and all of mine were on then. So I don't know how much background work Google were doing to suck all these things into their system before they launched. But I would imagine it's not going to be much longer than Apple. Now, Apple say it takes 12 to 24 hours or something, 2 to 3 days, I think, once you put your RSS feed and artwork into Podcast Connect. But I find it only takes an hour or 2 before it's up and running. So I suspect it may not be that quick with Google, but it may very well be. So it's just something to keep an eye on. And of course, Spotify's using the Apple system, and I'm getting some good results there. So that's another way for Android listeners, particularly, to pick up on podcasts. It's been, there's 4 Android phones for every iPhone in the world. And yet 65-70% of podcast listens are through the Apple ecosystem. There's that word again. So we're on the cusp of something huge if Google doesn't abandon things like they did with Google Plus and whatnot. But I suspect from what they've been saying, they're in for the long haul. The thoughts on that, Rich? You seen any changes?
I must admit, no, I haven't been following it, but other than what you've been telling me, John, but it's interesting what you said about being on the cusp of a change as far as podcasting goes. It seems that Google's had a look at it and they wouldn't be putting their money on it unless they thought that this had a future. So with that in mind, if we had Google behind podcasting now, what sort of future do you think podcasting's got, let's say in the next 5 years or so? Will it increase a lot more than what it is at the moment, or pretty much stagnate, do you think?
Okay, the way I look at it, with just the Apple ecosystem as the main driver for podcasting, we've been getting a steady 2 to 4% growth every year. Now, if that's an economy, that's a healthy growth. Happened with when Google bought YouTube, suddenly video exploded. And now there's no podcast thing for Google to purchase. But by putting the weight of their algorithm and their search tools and whatnot behind podcasting, and they're throwing money around trying to add more diversity. They, I think they did an internship for 10 people, females of colour, where they were looking for to promote their stuff and give them some training. There was 150,000 people applied. So there's, excuse me, the supply side's there. It's just a matter of allowing Google to then, what's the word I'm after, connect to the demand. And I know people that have no idea what podcasting is. So I've met and I show them. I say, well, tell me a hobby you're interested in. And I download an app onto their phones, if it's not an iPhone, and search that topic area. Well, there's these people talking about this. Wow, I never knew this existed. So
yes,
read across the top of the search with Google, and most people use Google to search. I did meet someone the other day that uses Yahoo, which was curious. Mind you, their personal email is a Hotmail, so
okay,
it was like talking to someone from another time.
Yes. Do they have Netscape?
Not quite, and they don't, and I have to pedal to get their router to work. But anyway, I think the future's looking good. In the same way that video exploded with the Google's purchase of YouTube, I think now that they start pushing podcasting and they're throwing money at it to train other people. 10 people's not many, I realise, but the fact that there are 150,000 applied is a bit of a clue that Google's onto something. So, yeah, I expect exponential growth rather than the 2 to 4%, but we'll see. Either way, it's not going to stop me podcasting, whether it's the 2 to 4% or the exponential. I suspect we're on the cusp, and it's a whole other different way of listening and a whole other way of accessing content that is available out there to the world. I think.
So, John, I was going to say, it's interesting you were saying podcasting starting to seep down. Even Carol, my wife, viewers and listeners, has finally allowed me to download Pocket Casts on her Android phone, and now she spends more time listening to podcasts than she does watching television, which is what she normally does. Yeah. And she's opening a shop, so her interests are downloading podcasts that have that sort of interest about it, design programs and things like that. And it didn't take long. It took, just I downloaded the Pocket Cast for her and she was away. So it's so easy to use, and people, once they do understand that, they can pretty much get anything for free on the topic of their choice, and it's just all there. It's just a matter of educating them. I did put a proposal to a client of mine, writing client of mine. I won't mention any names, and I took a whole couple of pages to point out how beneficial a podcast would be for him. And he got back to me with one line, and he says, I think, what did he say? What is a Pocket Cast? I've been using the word podcast throughout. It's a podcast. So I just said, look, don't worry.
Won't I see you face to face?
No.
And face to face is easy. You just show people, and showing's better than telling quite often. But
exactly,
that being the case, our next few episodes we did sort of fit in nicely with people that want to join in the fun, because we covered choosing a name, hosting options, whether or not to work with a co-host. And as there's 4 million blogs out there, and I think there's only 500,000 podcasts, and of the 500,000, maybe 250,000 are active. So there's lots of room in the space if you want to come and join the fun. And so choosing a name, that involves also obviously choosing the right artwork to display the name, because the picture that you use, the artwork comes down to thumbnail size on most phones. So it's got to be legible and obvious what it's about. And then hosting options we went through. There's the free versions and the paid. And I recommended the paid because then you know that they're around for a while. There's been lots of free options that have come and gone. And then we worked with whether or not to have a co-host. And most of the time I'm happy to have one in certain areas. What about yourself, Rich?
Yeah, I guess I'm not the type of person that's a natural extrovert, John. So, listeners and viewers, I think it's better for me personally to have a co-host to work off. So I do a lot of my work with John, and we're releasing a new podcast soon. And I also do some work with Mark Spencer of Climactic, and it just suits my personality to be in a support role, as I am on this particular webinar, I presume, as well. But others wouldn't have it. They wouldn't have anyone near them. They want to put out there what they want to say. They know what they want to say, and they're very good. And if that's the case, then that's fantastic. If that suits them. So I think it's just down to personality, isn't it, John?
And it's also about choosing the style of your show as well. A lot of the shows I do on my own, they're audio essays. And an audio essay doesn't really work well with a co-host. If you have people reading alternate paragraphs, it tends to bugger up the flow. And if you're going to have a co-host, it also depends on the style of the co-host and the style of the show. Now, there are shows out there that basically have one person doing it and they just do interviews. Sometimes co-host with an interview works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the co-host can discuss the interview before and after. But either way, it depends on what it is you're trying to do. Now, a lot of businesses that are more than one person, they'll have the 2 or 3 main characters from the business on, so that you get to know them and their personality and how you can tell a lot about a business by the people that are in it. And now I know other shows where it's just a one-person business, and so they just do interviews or they just do monologues. So it's a personality thing, and it's also about part of the process when you start doing your pre-launch to think about how you want to do it. And learning how to work with a co-host in a different space geographically can be an issue technically for people. Like this we're using at the moment is Google Hangouts on Air, and I'll rip the audio out and put that up as a podcast later. But there are also things like Zoom, which does the same thing. Cast is another one we use. Encaster, and there's a few others. Skype, of course, is the one most people tend to fall back on, but I've never used it. I don't like it. But how can I say I don't like it if I've never used it? I've been interviewed by other people using Skype, and I don't like the sound quality of it. And drop in and out even more than Google Hangouts does. So that's why I don't use it. And the Cast, and I think Zencastr and those sorts of things, they record at each end so that you end up with your 2 tracks.
Might be a good idea, John. Sorry, Johnson. So it might be a good idea to try a few out just to see if it suits you, Yeah. I was just going to put the point in too about co-hosts. When you start off, you factor in the time that's going to take. I mean, we all have lives to live and jobs to go to. You haven't got unlimited time unless you're retired or whatever. But a co-host can help take a lot of the work away. Not just in the podcast itself, but a co-host can do blogs, can do help maintain the website, that sort of thing. So that's another reason why you might want to consider a co-host.
Yeah, no, good point. Good point. And we're doing that with the new one that's coming out, Permaculture Plus, next month on the 15th of September. Keep your eye out, people. It's a blinder. We're both doing things on the website, and we're both doing things in the scripting. And so it does halve the work in a lot of ways, but equally you both share the same artistic vision.
That's true. And it's easier for us, John. We have known each other for decades. So we sort of understand each other. It's a little bit more difficult if you're starting out with someone you don't know. And as John says, it's the artistic vision. Make sure you do share that vision. And it's all right to have different personalities. In fact, that's good. And another point I was going to just make, just from what you said then, John, is that when you are working together with a co-host, building the show, either scripting or blogging or whatever, having an extra person there, that sort of adds energy, sort of synergy, if that's the right word, and it improves your output as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, John.
No, you're right, man. Also act as a check on each other's work, so spelling mistakes and things like that get picked up. Yeah. And then, of course, there's choosing the name, which is also easier somewhat when you've got two people to bounce it back and forth rather than yourself. Again, they're all pre-launch ideas. Then we went on to the recording space. And as you can see from the photos here in the background, I'm in the kitchen. And I think if you have a look at the back of Rich there, you can see he's in a standard bedroom, standard room of some sort.
That's the... Yes, it's the studios, John, otherwise known as the back room. Yes, the spare room, yep.
Yeah. Podcast Essentials South Studio. Yeah.
Yes.
We covered things like how to dampen noise, how to stop reflective surfaces and whatnot. And as you can see, there's a hard surface behind me, but there's a bit of distance in front of me which you can't see, so that the sound isn't bouncing straight back. And the last place I was in, because we're on the move at the moment, I was able to hang a throw rug just in front of me and have that all sort of scrunchy so that the sound was absorbed and baffled. So there's means around. I'd go back and have a look at that episode if you got more interest in it. There's also blog posts associated with it and whatnot. And from that, we went on to microphones and their alternatives. Now, I don't use a microphone as such. This is a audio recorder. Rich uses a microphone in his Southern Hemisphere studio there. It's just off to his right, I believe.
Yes, here we go. It's coming through now. There we are.
Spooky. Yep. And we covered things like digital audio recorders, microphones like Rich is using. And the fact that there are pretty good apps on the iPhone and Android phone now that, given the quality of the microphones on the phones, are good enough to record what you need. You just need to be a little bit more careful with the sound around you. And quite often when you're using those things, they're a stopgap measure out in the open. Like you bumped into someone in a coffee shop or whatever, and we talked about how to reduce noises and whatnot. And you can't, and so you just tell your listeners beforehand, this was recorded in an outside space. We're in a coffee shop. You might hear the rattle of crockery and the hiss and hum of a cappuccino machine in the background. And people are forgiving because if the content's worthwhile, they'll filter those things out. So, which led nicely onto our next episode, which was on production standards. And it's about filtering out all the things we don't want, hanging on to the things we do want, and then that struggle between file size and sound quality and file size and downloadability for our listeners. And I've come to the compromise of 64 megabits per second for bitrate size for my audio. because that makes the file small enough for people to download in areas where their bandwidth isn't optimal. And for people who are in 4G and ADSL and what's the other one, fibre to the home, it happens so quickly they're not going to notice whether it's 64 or 500, whatever. So it allows people that couldn't hear me to hear me with less drama. I think it's the best way of putting it. You have thoughts on that, Rich?
Just one thing, John. And I mentioned it in the episode. I think it's probably worth raising again. I was downloading it at 112 megabits per second because I had a bit of music at the opening and closing. And what I found was that the Libsyn account that I had was just a very basic account, and you just bought hosting and stats, but it only gives you a certain amount of megabytes. And if I was, as I was doing, going up to 112, I was finding that about 3/4 of the way through the month, I had to buy extra hosting, which was obviously not ideal. So I went back to 64. I think I contacted you, John. I got back to 64, and the quality hasn't really changed, hasn't been noticeable. And I don't need to buy any more hosting from Libsyn. I presume that's the same for other hosting sites as well.
Yeah, the good ones have a limit on how much you can use each month. That way they can control their costs, and they stay in existence for longer. Libsyn's been around since 2004, I think, and Blue years after, something like that. They're both really good. It's important to make sure the sound quality is high enough for people to listen, but the file size is small enough for them to download. And it's a compromise. It's always a compromise. And unless you're an audiophile with the most expensive headsets and all the rest of it, or you're sitting in a surround sound place, no one's going to notice the difference between 64 and 112.
Yeah.
And on that, I also do it in mono because, as you can see here, I've only got the one earphone in. I only ever listen with one earphone. That also helps to keep the file size small enough. If you do it in stereo, you're doubling your file size. But for people who listen with one earphone, they're losing half the show. And it's a compromise, but I don't think it makes much difference basically for audio, for spoken word, because that's how we hear people anyway.
I just wonder if I could make a point there, John, that also, I don't know the figures, perhaps you do, John, but I'd imagine that most podcasts are now consumed on the go, with people with their phones plugged in while they're walking, commuting, driving, exercising, whatever. I don't think that many podcasts would be consumed sitting in front of, say, a desktop computer anymore. And people that are on the go are not going to concentrate on the sound quality. They want something that's good, that they can hear, but as long as it's good enough. Would that be correct, do you think, John? Do you think most people are listening to stuff on the go now, podcasts?
Yeah, well, that's the thing with podcasts. It's the only medium that's portable. You can't. It's difficult to walk down the street reading a blog post or watching a video, whereas you can scan the world and get in touch with reality while you're still listening to the podcast. It doesn't seem to have any negative effects on driving ability, the same way that texting or watching videos does. So yeah, it is a mobile, intimate, personal space, and you just take it with you. I was listening to another podcast, and this bloke was saying he and his wife listen to the same shows, but never at the same time, because they do it while they're doing other things, and they might talk about it. But to actually turn it on and have it out loud, not sort of in an ear pod or an headphone, the idea was just abhorrent to him and to her. Because they'll listen to it when they want to listen to it, and that's the other thing. But it's an on-demand thing. One episode's been published, obviously. Excuse me. Then we went on to a little bit more. Well, I've already covered that. We did some outside recording. discussions on that and techniques for keeping the noise levels down and whatnot. And then we got a little bit fancy with adding layers of sound effects and music and whatnot. I was able to add a suspense set of noises into the middle of that podcast as we were talking about it, and after I'd ripped the audio out, so that the podcast version had a slightly different sound effect to it, to the Hangout. But again, a matter of subtlety with adding sounds and layers. And that led on to storytelling. And the idea of adding the sounds is to enhance the storytelling rather than to show how clever you are with the audio. I think there was a fellow I was talking about who added reverb every time he was reading a quote, so that we quote, and that stopped after 2 episodes because he got so many saying how annoying it was. Just say quote and end quote at the beginning and end. Oh, it's a quote.
Yep. That was the episode, John, where was my favourite quote from the entire series, where you said storytelling was what defined us as human beings, which I thought was quite magnificent and excellent lead in. It is, isn't it? And you go back through history, that is stories that define us and shape us and have allowed our species to survive in a lot of ways. Would that be correct, John?
Well, I don't know of any other species that tell stories, but then I don't speak dolphin or dog. But it does hear that. Quite like that quote too.
It's quite good. Cranking them out tonight, John.
Like we are, but that's one of the things that separates us from the other species. I mean, other animals will make simple tools the way humans used to back in the day, crows and whatnot. But I don't know of any other species that in which storytelling is such an embedded part of their existence and their cultures. And in fact, the stories are what define the cultures, and that it's the coming together of cultures and stories that leads to synergies and all kinds of interesting things. But it's an important part, and it's something to think about while you're doing your you're planning. The hero's journey can get a bit monotonous. Do you have to have Obi-Wan Kenobi come in, or can it be a crow or something else? It's a doable style, but you need to be flexible with it. But it's important to understand the mechanics of it before you start fiddling with it. There's that other old saying that you can't be a heretic until you've been ordained. So you have to know your system well before you start messing with it. But then we did a quick chat on copyright, because storytelling and adding sound effects and whatnot can lead some people to start borrowing, in inverted commas, things that aren't theirs. And I think the upshot of the whole copyright episode was, if you didn't do it, don't use it. There are options. What are they? Creative Commons licenses, and there's a few of those. You need to read those, and they will allow you to use other people's work sometimes. And you need to get it in writing from publishers and whatnot of music. Again, as I said in the podcast episode, for the version of that episode, neither Rich nor I are legal practitioners, and what we said in that episode was not meant to be construed as legal advice. It was just what we've discovered from real life and how we keep ourselves pod safe. And most publishers require you to be pod safe, which means there's no copyright breaches in your work. I don't know how people check it, but if you become famous, someone will notice that stray. So just stay on the safe side and produce your own stuff. I mean, it's ethically and morally, it's a far safer place to be anyway, let alone legally. Are you any thoughts on that, Rich?
Time
at Alpha?
I agree with what you're saying, John. But don't be afraid if you wanted to put in a theme and you want to play with a bit of music between sections. Just go into CC Search. That's Creative Commons Search. And if you're intending to make money out of the podcast, you'll need to tick for, I think it's there's a number of boxes for copyright purposes. Just make sure you tick the box for, I just can't remember the name, the phrase. Do you remember that, John, how it's for?
Commercial use?
Commercial use. I think that's probably it. Make sure you tick that box and put in your search, go into Google Images, and it'll find the Creative Commons license for you. Now, that can be images, that can be music or whatever. Just be a bit careful, but if you really would like to have music, and it's something that I like to put in as a theme, yeah, a little bit of exploration under Creative Commons can be quite fruitful.
Yep. And the other thing, of course, is if you know a musician, you can get up some theme music for you. You acknowledge it and you promote their stuff, and everyone wins.
Yes.
So, but if you are concerned about copyright, contact a qualified legal practitioner, which is neither Rich nor I. Our next sort of 5 episodes sort of rolled into one sort of theme. So we went from defining your audience, finding your voice, editing and scripting. And then, of course, there was the post-production work with Electronic last Tuesday. And defining your audience is sort of a reflection of your voice as well. The style of voice you're using, and that's just from the technical levels in the recording to the artistic pitch of the voice, the style, whether it's academic, conversational, storytelling, that sort of thing. They all intertwine with each other, intertwine. And then that determines how much editing you need to do, avoiding the ums and ahs and whatnot. Cutting those out sort of fairly obvious. But the style of editing, whether you want longer gaps or shorter gaps between statements, or you're going to slide a bit of music or sound effects or whatever in there. Oh, I'm back on that sound effects thing and music while I think about it. There's a tab on YouTube. If you just Google YouTube sound effects, it'll come up with a page of sound effects, and at the top of that page is also a tab for music that's completely free to use.
Okay.
So the option there that I forgot to mention earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And once you've found your voice and you know how you're going to edit, the style that you're going to edit in, the question is, do you script the shows or not? Now, with my monologue episodes, I script to the very last nth degree. That way I'm not going to miss anything out, because they're basically audio essays. So I'm trying to make a point, an argument, and leading people on a journey. Now, the new show we're doing, Rich Permaculture Plus, we've been doing sort of scripting, but with license to wander off script. You find that's a good compromise?
Yes, there's tightly scripting, John, and then there's no scripting at all, where it's just ad hoc. And then in the middle, there's something like a sort of semi-script, where you might put a sentence or two down that you follow, but then perhaps just include points. So it gives you a start, and you know where you're going, and with the points that you put down, you know how to continue that. But it gives it that little bit loose, little bit more conversational style, I think. So, yeah, I think we'll call ours sort of semi-scripted, John, at the moment. We may change that, but it seems to work at the moment.
Yeah, well, on that point, I listen to about 200 odd shows a week, and one popped up in my feed this morning. I went, great, because I look forward to this person's podcast. And I don't know, maybe 20, 30 episodes back, they'd been to a public speaking course, and they did 5 or 6 shows based on the skills they'd learnt from that public speaking course. And there was force, there was power, there was direction, there was purpose. I hit play this morning and they said, note to future self, I'm not going to edit, we're just going to talk for 40 minutes. And I looked at the thing and it goes on for an hour and a minute. So I'll come back to that much later. But I find it shows a bit more respect to the listener to have what you want to say more tightly crafted than just the waffle and the wombling off in different directions. Now, that has its place too in a scripted episode, like the semi-scripted we were talking about earlier. But I think as a matter of respect for the listener, that it's better to be tighter. And like there were quite a few podcasts, and if it gets to the point and it's direct to the point, then it's fine. And I find I look forward to those. And even the interview shows where people can tend to wander off a bit, a well-crafted interview show, well edited, and with purposeful questions, flows just as well as a tightly scripted one. So, and remember that the whole point of podcasting isn't for us to say on our CV, podcaster. The idea of podcasting is to serve an audience. And if we keep the experience our listeners have in mind the whole time, underpinning everything we do, then I think we need better shows that are more tightly focused and of relevance to those listeners. Your thoughts on
that? Just cutting out a little bit there, John. I think you said thoughts. It's just an idea, actually, more than the thought. If you are starting out and you're unsure the sort of scripting that you want, whether it's going to be tightly scripted, whether it's going to be semi-scripted, or it's just going to be completely ad hoc, just talk into a microphone. Excuse me. Just talk into a microphone. First, do a segment that's tightly scripted, then semi-scripted, and then just do it off the cuff. See which one sounds best. The one off the cuff might be directionless, or it might be okay. And if you've got a co-host, if you can get them in, and just talk in front of a microphone, listen to the recording, see which one comes out best, and then decide on whether or not you do need to script and what sort of scripting it is.
The other thing to remember is that for the first 5 or 10 episodes, no one's listening anyway. So you're just learning. And you decide to do it tightly scripted and then get looser. It's sort of semi-scripted. Looser probably is a bit too pejorative. But if you move from tightly scripted to ad hoc, as your skills improve, that might not be a bad thing either. And you're allowed to evolve and change how you do your show. While be maintaining the listener experience in the back of our mind, it is still your show and there are no rules. The only thing that perhaps might be of importance is the use of explicit language, which will get you banned from India and I believe China as well. But that might not be your target market. But if it is, remember, keep that in mind. But otherwise, you can do what you like with the show. I mean, there's this one I do, which is a teaching show. There's World Organic News, which I guess is a teaching show as well, but it's also about promoting organics around the world. And then there's another one I do called Sound Collages, where I just put together whatever feels right creatively. And sometimes that can sound a bit jarring and a bit different. But if people know that's what it's about, and hopefully they can tell from the title, it's not going to be an interview episode, even though I might take chunks out of interviews I've done to mix things up and have shock value and whatnot. The trick is to remember it's your show and you can do what you like with it. The recommendations Rich and I have made through this about 64 kilobits per second MP3 output and mono and things like that are just that, recommendations. You're quite free to put out whatever you want. There are consequences for every choice, obviously. And if you're going to do in 256 kilobits per second in stereo, you're going to have a huge file and you're going to have to pay for more space. But if that's what you want, and that's the market you're after requires that, and that's what you do. But for most beginners, I think the standards that we've come up with make it easier for them, makes it listenable for their listeners, and gives them a foot in and a way to start podcasting quickly. You thoughts on that, Rich?
Yeah, exactly. It's your own show. You do what you want within, I suppose, defamatory regulations, but really you're out there to enjoy yourself and to service listeners. So, yeah, as John said, look, play around with things. If you're not happy with the way things are going, shift it around a bit. Try bring in a co-host or try a different format, different style, different way of scripting, and just see what works. I know, John, when you started, you said it took it took ages before you were comfortable both with your voice and with the podcast. So it's not going to happen overnight. It may do, but usually it doesn't happen overnight. But just make sure you're having fun when you're doing it and enjoying what you're doing, because it does take a bit of time.
Yeah, and when the tech becomes second nature, then you're free to be creative. So this will be probably planning towards the end of September for the next one to start, because I've got some travelling to do, and then we're moving house again. So probably about probably late September, because we've got Permaculture Plus coming out on the 15th of September. Looking out for that, folks, and remember to subscribe so that you get every episode. That's going to be a monthly show. We're going to go into some depth on permaculture and life and the meaning of life and how we can all live better lives in a lot of ways through gardening. But we'll see. So the next series will be on sort of post-launching, after you've done all your show ready to go. So I thought we might start off with a plan for launching the show, and then we'll talk about more artistic rather than scientific sides of podcasting. So, attitude and of course the dreaded show notes, which we didn't get to this series, which are a pain, but they're also essential because it allows people to see who you are and connect with you on a deeper level, and you can direct them to websites and whatnot if you're building a community that way. Got anything else before we pull this one to an end, Rich? Because we've been going.
You've gone over a bit, haven't we?
Than all the other.
Look, just to thank you on behalf of listeners and viewers, John, for the series, and on behalf of myself as well, because I've learnt a great deal, and it's come at the best time for me as we're launching the new podcast very soon. So I'll take on board those lessons and put them to use. And if you're out there thinking about starting your own podcast and you've missed some of these, just go to mrjohnmoore.com and just go back and view all of them. They've been a lot of fun, but very interesting as well. So thanks very much, John. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say on that.
On that matter, you can probably go to the website, mrjohnmoore.com. There's checklists that help get you started in the pre-launch process. There's also copies of PodSorts, which is the podcast I put the audio out under that comes from these shows. And the links, well, the actual videos, some videos are up on the left-hand side as well. And if you click through to those, you can go through to the whole lot of them. So any feedback would be greatly appreciated. And if anyone's got anything they want Rich and I to cover in the next series or next season, is the technical term these days, what's a line? You can get me at john@mrjohnmoore.com. And if you've got any questions for Rich, I'll flick those onto him. Save you having to remember 2 email addresses. And I'll put that in the show notes and whatnot.
Maybe one might be where we get our hats from, John. What do you think about that? They're not matching, but they're similar.
We have to keep some mystery in the business. And that's really not going to work for the people on the podcast. But anyway, you can imagine what sort of hats we got.
Exactly.
On that happy note, we will pull this one to a close, and we'll see you in about a month. Thanks again, John.